Hi, my name is Chris Clark. I'm a senior curator here at the Glucksman in University College Cork in Ireland, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first in our new series of conversations on curating. Conversation on Curating is a program that the Glucksman runs in collaboration with UCC's Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies, and also a program initiated by Carlos Garrido Castellano, who I see is attending here today as well. And it explores how curating is continuously redefined and repositioned in ways that go beyond exhibition making. It draws on local and global networks of curatorial scholars and practitioners. And each conversation is presented online, of course, extending the museum's focus on contemporary intersections between visual culture, critical thought, and curating, and the discursive relationships between academic research and art practice. For today's talk, I'm very pleased to welcome Josée Drouin-Brisebois. Josée is the Senior Curator of Contemporary Art, responsible for collections of Canadian and international contemporary art at the National Gallery of Canada. She's been involved with the representation of Canada at the Venice Biennale for the last decade, organizing the Canadian participation in the 2013 and 2015 Venice Biennales with Sherry Boyle and Stephen Shearer, respectively. Sorry, 2013-2011. She also served as project director for Jeffrey Farmer's participation in 2017 and was the lead curator of Asuma for the 2019 edition. She's curator of the forthcoming 13th Kaunas Biennial in Lithuania, opening in November. And she's curated numerous exhibitions, including at the National Gallery of Canada, as well as at the Art Gallery of Alberta, the Museum of Contemporary Art Toronto, and the rooms in St. John's. In addition to publishing catalogs for the National Gallery and the Venice Biennale, her writing on contemporary art has appeared in a variety of publications and periodicals in Canada and abroad. So what we'll be doing today, the format tends to run that after my introduction here, we're going to show a pre-recorded conversation between myself and Josée for roughly about 30 minutes. And that will be then followed by a live link up to allow for a moderated conversation, questions and answers. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat function and we'll get to them then. And you should be muted and your video should be blocked, but if not, please do. Also, this film will be available on YouTube afterwards, so just keep that in mind that your contributions will be shared. Before we turn over to the conversation with Josée, I just want big thanks to the Arts Council for their support, as well as in terms of kind of accessing images for the talk, Josée in the National Gallery of Canada, the Canada Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and Singa Kulik at the Kaunas Biennial. So without further ado, I'm very happy to turn over to my conversation with Josée Drouin-Brisebois. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you about was, because we're looking at this conversations on curating here, and I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about how you actually decided to embark on curating as a profession, and were there particular exhibition making models or curatorial models or individuals who informed that decision, or alternatively even artists' works that you saw and felt a desire to kind of want to work with them and to share their practice?
I think that's a good question. I probably have come to curating in a different way. I was actually trained as an artist and I went to art school, and I had the privilege of doing an internship at the National Gallery, and my internship entailed looking at a lot of video, and so like hundreds of videos, and I was quite fascinated by just a breadth of what was already there, what already existed, and it gave me more interest in working with artists and being a kind of mediator to help audiences connect to works of art. So that was really maybe a bit of a unusual in that it wasn't like something that I saw from afar. I actually kind of like went into it with a different intention, and I decided to do a master's in art history. So I'm more of an art historian, artist turned curator.
What were those particular, I mean, during an internship like that, I mean, obviously, I'm just thinking of in Canada that, I mean, that strong West Coast conceptual art video scene, but also things that were coming out of Nova Scotia, obviously in Toronto and Quebec, and I guess certainly recently, I mean, some of the things in the prairies have been kind of filtering their way over even into Ireland, I suppose. Were there particular works or that you felt a connection to that maybe informed that particular interest in contemporary practices?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, having had my own practice, I was definitely interested in, you know, I was more of a performance artist and a media artist. So those were the practices I was most keenly interested in. But I would say performance being very important, and starting to understand at that time, even when I was in my, you know, early 20s, the breadth of performance art that had been done in Canada, and that was not very well known. So you know, and sort of early video work as well, and understanding that was really important, in kind of creating a bit of an international identity for Canadian artists. So that was really where I came from. And it, of course, expanded from there. But looking at, you know, General Idea, looking at the Western Front, and kind of those practices that were related to, you know, more performative, a little bit outside the box in a way, you know, with A.A. Bronson and General Idea really being tapped into an international art network as well. So I was quite fascinated with those practices. So I would say that was the first, you know, opening up my mind of you know, thinking about Canada and thinking about Canada within the bigger contemporary art world.
I mean, certainly internationally, very kind of important moments there, I think, in kind of contemporary practices with those artists and those kind of collectives. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your long-standing involvement with the Venice Biennale and the Canada Pavilion. This ties back to the idea, I guess, of the collective in your most recent project there. So in 2019, you were the lead curator on the Canadian Pavilion, working with the collective Asuma, who were the first-time Inuit artists were chosen to represent Canada on this kind of international stage. Can you talk a little bit about that process, how that decision came about? What it might have required in terms of your kind of research and your development around that exhibition, and your experience in collaborating with this kind of multimedia collective.
Well, it was definitely a huge project. It was I learned a lot through this process in so many ways. I think I could probably spend half an hour talking about that. It was probably one of the most challenging projects I've done on certain levels. And the decision came, and we always bring together a selection committee for Venice, and the National Gallery is the organizer, but we are not necessarily involved in the curating aspect. That depends. Sometimes we have guest curators. And in this particular case, the idea was to work with a group of curators. So it wasn't just myself, I was the lead, but the collective nature of Asuma and the collective nature of the curatorial group made it very rewarding. Also worked with a young Inuit curator, Asina, and that was quite fantastic. And you know, we brought her on the project thinking she was going to be a mentee and I was going to be a mentor, and I think it turned the other way around, and she definitely became my mentor in many ways. But I also learned I learned how to work in a more collaborative way. I learned as well that you need to put or give a lot of space to silence. That sometimes, you know, someone who doesn't speak very loud doesn't mean they don't have something to say. So that was also interesting, you know, to kind of, you know, when you're working with artists from different cultures as well, to kind of get more immersed and understand there's different ways of communicating, and that you need to be aware of that and to give space for that. So that I learned a lot. In terms of the project itself and Asuma, definitely as well a great opportunity. So they're mainly known as filmmakers, but they're also activists. They also work very closely with Inuit communities and want to help make change. So that gave the project a kind of like another element to it, and thinking about what we could do, how we could honor that. So we brought in young Inuit filmmakers to Venice as well, so that they could experience Asuma on the international world stage. We had not only the film in the pavilion. So it was a new film called One Day in the Life of Noah Piugatuk. And they were already working on the film, but it was perfect because it was set in the early 60s. The pavilion was built in the late 50s. So there was kind of like this interesting moment as well, just in time, and how like, people that are so far away could have like a very different experience of the same moment. And, their films are slow, so there's something really interesting about that too, and thinking about time in a different way, and what does it mean to slow down time and to slow down audiences. And that's not an easy feat in Venice. Because people are there like, and they want to see a lot of things quickly. And I was really quite impressed with how many people stayed, and there was this kind of like hypnotic effect of the video. The other thing that we really wanted, because a lot of the footage is, of course, outside, it's very bright. We didn't want to create a dark space. We really wanted it to feel like you were outside, and that's perfect in the Canada Pavilion because we have a lot of glass, which is not great for some installations, but in this case, by choosing to use video monitors, we're able to have a space that was very light and airy, and that connected you to the outside, and you could still watch video and get immersed. And so it was the same film was repeated on a number of different screens, and with different subtitles. So we had French, Italian, and English subtitles, which was also really interesting because the language is Inuktitut. And it was also the Year of Indigenous Languages. So it was kind of like all came together in a really beautiful way. And there was also another component, which was there was some programming that was live from Igloolik as well. So at certain times during the exhibition, you could have like a live feed coming into the Canada Pavilion, which again, to me, was about that idea of connecting.
Well, I think it was quite deftly handled in that sense. It's interesting the way you talk about that, kind of creating this sense of kind of the outside, because I guess one of the challenges for me, even just thinking about a project like that, and I also spent quite a bit of time in there as well. I got completely locked into their work and this kind of diffuse, diverse kind of practice that they have. But also it kind of signaled, I think, visitors towards their work on Asuma.tv. This kind of vast archive of projects that have, to some extent have been shown in, I know they had a feature film that won the Camera d'Or in Cannes Film Festival, and of course this kind of landmark Nunavut television series that they produced. But that idea, I think, of kind of pushing the viewer to kind of go a bit deeper into the archive, I thought was something that really came across in the show.
Mm-hmm. And we wanted to make it like as accessible as possible too. I mean, it was about creating something welcoming, and knowing that, if people didn't have time to spend, 2 hours to watch the film, that they could also watch it online, and making that, available in Italy as well. So thinking, about access in a different way. So it was interesting to work that way, as opposed to making things exclusive. What happens if you make them really inclusive? So we talked a lot about radical inclusivity when we were curating the project.
I mean, of course, it's not your first involvement with the Canada Pavilion, and you kind of maybe touched on this a little bit about how you kind of transform that space. So, for example, you curated the representations of Stephen Shearer and Sherry Boyle in previous years, and were project director for Jeffrey Farmer's 2017 exhibition, which is something maybe I want to kind of address a little bit here, because there's such a kind of a radical transformation of this quite unique architectural space. So having worked with these very different artists, very different projects, but with also a quite particular architectural space. And how do you address the kind of, obviously the architectural and historical significance of the Canadian Pavilion to these very different projects and proposals? I mean, do you tend to work through this with the artist, or are you always kind of aware on some level that you have this quite idiosyncratic, challenging pavilion space to work with? How do you adapt to those kind of those ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways I can approach that question. One thing I do want to mention is that having had that experience in Venice, it's been so rewarding to work with different artists and to kind of learn about the pavilion and its the possibilities there, because it does at first present itself as something quite difficult to work in and work with, and I'm not denying it is, but at the same time there's something interesting about having those constraints and what that can enable in a different way, because you do have to integrate or think about the pavilion, and I think the projects that have been most successful over the years have been those that artists have really thought about how to respond to that space. And I've actually written a book or an essay in a book on the Canada Pavilion that's been published just in the spring last year, that goes through the 60 years. So if you want more, definitely can send you a copy of that, because it kind of goes through, from the early moments of the pavilion in the 50s, how the representation of artists has evolved and changed over time. And that's something that I just want to highlight, because, the building was conceived in the late 50s, and it was also in response to the Second World War, and creating a building that was much more humanist in a way. So the scale is very human compared to some of the other pavilions, the neighboring pavilions, for example. So you have already a kind of different scale. And that enables really interesting things. It enables intimacy, and it's also a very dynamic space. So you can think about the viewer in interesting ways, and that connection between inside and outside. So as much as there are some difficulties, because of course there's a lot of light coming in.
Tree.
There's a tree. There's two trees. There's one right in the pavilion, but it also speaks to kind of a respective nature, and I think that is also interesting to think about. And a lot of Canadian artists have thought about that over, the history. So, I mean, in terms of an approach, if we want to focus on Jeffrey Farmer, it was an interesting time because we wanted to renovate the pavilion. And originally we were supposed to have the pavilion already renovated before his show. And then he asked me, he said, well, what if, I do the show while we're renovating? And so, have an amazing opportunity to almost like look at the building in a different state, a state of, not ruin, but kind of like going into like definitely a deconstructed phase, and what that meant in terms of bringing attention to the pavilion. So that became a really important part of the project, and thinking around trauma and, and very personal stories for the artist, but also the building itself being in this kind of trauma of like being deconstructed and not having a roof and not having a facade and all of this. And at the same time, something quite vulnerable about it. And the fact that it was a kind of monument to the Second World War. So thinking around that as well. So it worked really well. It was definitely a lot of challenges. But I think, I think artists are amazing. They come see the pavilion, and that's where it starts. It really starts with them coming and seeing it, and, reacting to it. And I've been really privileged to have had that experience a number of times now.
I mean, I want to ask you a little bit, obviously, about your role as a senior curator of contemporary art at the National Gallery of Canada. And there you're responsible for collections of Canadian and international contemporary art. Can you tell us a little bit about what this role entails, and and maybe some projects that have stood out for you over your term there at the National Gallery.
I hesitate to say how long I've been there, but
No, start with internship, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I'm actually from Ottawa, so that gives you a sense. So it's definitely a long-standing relationship with the museum. And I did leave at one point and came back. There's just something about that building, something about the people that I get to work with, and of course the collection that you get attached to when you're involved with such an amazing collection that's been passed on from different curators. So what I do, I mean, I'm responsible for Canadian and international. Definitely the collection is a big part of my focus. So bringing in new works by Canadian, but also international artists. Thinking about, you know, this is an interesting moment in terms of definitely looking at what we haven't looked at. So that is what I've been trying to do in this moment. We're doing things differently. So doing studio visits by Zoom instead of in person, and definitely enjoying those conversations. And so that's been really quite interesting. We're working on a number of big projects. Right now, we're focusing on commissioned works. So creating the opportunity for artists to make new work that responds to our spaces and our collection, and particularly our public spaces, which have, I would say, been not invested enough with art, and those spaces are free for visitors. So also thinking about accessibility, thinking about ways that we can create more encounters with contemporary art throughout the building, and not necessarily only in the Special X spaces or in the contemporary gallery. So kind of like trying to expand a little bit, and even beyond the gallery, we have works outside as well. So to me, that's been really amazing. And some of the projects that I'm most proud of is projects that have that ability to encounter, that you have the ability to encounter outside, and maybe in spaces that you weren't expecting to have an encounter with contemporary art. And then some of the exhibitions that I've been involved with that delved into performance, as I spoke about a bit earlier, and looking at that legacy, working with artists like Rebecca Belmore, Maury Baden, Jana Sturbach, who also have, you know, very interdisciplinary practices, and kind of leading into a younger generation with, at the time, Jeffrey Farmer, who's now, you know, quite established, but he was more newly established at the time, Rodney Latourelle, Kent Monkman, you know, so those kinds of projects where you can kind of make those bridges between different moments, different practices, and different generations of artists as well. So I'm quite proud of some of those projects.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly reflects the kind of breadth of practices, and also, I guess, communities across Canada, because you have, you know, this national remit of representing you know, obviously artists from First Nations or Métis or Inuit backgrounds, but also the provincial kind of span. I say this obviously as someone from the far ends of the provinces myself, but I guess this kind of sense of awareness of what's happening across this kind of incredible kind of landmass, but also this kind of very diverse micro communities as well.
Very diverse, very diverse. And I do miss right now having, you know, direct contact with a lot of people. I mean, we're keeping in touch, but at the same time, traveling and seeing the places and the artists in their own environments is so important to kind of get a better understanding. And that is such a wonderful part of my job, is to travel, to meet artists, and, you know, from coast to coast to coast.
And I guess, and how is the National Gallery kind of negotiating the current COVID-19 restriction situation? Is there, I mean, obviously it's had an impact there, as it has everywhere, but what measures have been put in place, or what kind of alternative programming has been instituted to deal with that inability, I guess, to kind of have those firsthand encounters?
Yeah, well, we're open today. So we've been closed since the 26th of December. So today is our reopening day.
Congratulations.
Yeah, exactly. And I was actually just in the galleries earlier in the week to finish an installation. So, I mean, we're definitely thinking, even in our building, about what people need right now, the kinds of encounters that they need with art, and that they need those encounters. We've heard a lot of feedback from our visitors that they really missed just being able to walk in the museum and see their favorite works of art. And so that's been really kind of I don't know, it's been humbling, but also wonderful to hear that feedback from visitors. And at the same time, thinking about more online presence, definitely doing more of these kinds of interviews, doing more programming on Instagram, on the different social media. And that's been interesting too, because it kind of extends beyond what we normally would be necessarily involved with as curators. So I've been it's been a learning curve, but I've appreciated those different types of encounters as well. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the museum itself, we've done, we followed the protocols. We're limiting the amount of visitors that can come into the building at one time, and thinking a bit differently about how we're going to install works so that we make sure that there's enough space between the works so that people don't need to crowd. And yeah, and I would say making some spaces a little bit bigger so that there is more space. And we have an exhibition opening in the summer, so we'll see how that goes. It's a beautiful exhibition of Rembrandt works, and it's there hasn't been an exhibition of Rembrandt since 1969 in Canada.
Oh,
So
wow.
it'll be a great moment. And I'm working on a commission with an artist to kind of offer counter narrative as well to that exhibition. So, and again, in the big public spaces. So again, with a lot of room around for visitors to feel safe.
Great. I mean, one thing also that you've been involved in for the last several years, certainly as part of your role within the National Gallery, has been the Sobey Art Award.
Mm-hmm.
This is Canada's preeminent prize for contemporary artists. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process of kind of selection, maybe your experiences in this kind of, because it has kind of an interesting kind of approach in that it has kind of different regions and then kind of shortlists from those regions before kind of making a selection. And actually, even today, I saw the announcement that the Sobey Art Prize has now gotten rid of its age limitations, as well as increasing the awards. So also fantastic news, and certainly something that should shake things up. But could you talk a little bit about your experiences with that, and what you feel that the Sobey Art Award, I guess, brings to kind of to Canada and to Canadian artists as this kind of moment of recognition?
Yeah. Well, I think the Sobey Art Award is fantastic. It's also working with the Sobey Art Foundation. The National Gallery's been working with them since 2016, but the prize started in 2002. So it's already like going to be almost 20 years old now, which is amazing when you think about the impact that the prize has had and who some of the winners have been in the past as well. What I would say is that it's an open nomination. So in terms of selection, my role in the past has been to put together the jury, and that has included an international jury member. And to me, that has changed a lot. There's been moments where I've understood a little bit more how to present the idea of regionalism, which is so important in Canada, in such a big country, and that might not be understood so well internationally. So that's been interesting to kind of explain a little bit why that is, because there's certain areas of Canada that have more opportunities than others. And that's at the core of what the Sobey Art Award is. I mean, it was born in Halifax, it was born in Nova Scotia, and kind of like understanding that, there are so many wonderful artists working all across the country. So that's been always an interesting conversation to have, and to, again, expand our network and work with jury members across the country. has been amazing, and to know what they're excited about as well. So it's an open nomination. It's open now until March 19th, and artists can nominate artists, dealers can nominate, curators can nominate artists, and of course without age restriction. It's still an emerging artist prize, so the idea is to kind of focus on artists that are new, that are less known, and that could benefit a lot from getting a wider attention to their work. And there is an exhibition as well that is planned at the National Gallery, and that will be in the fall. And then the prize winner will be announced in November at a gala. We don't know yet if it's going to be an in-person gala or if it's going to be a Zoom.
Oh, well.
we'll have to see at that time. Yeah, so the selection is underway, and then the jury members represent a region, and it's really up to them to kind of come up with the 5 artists for the long list, who now all get $10,000. And then together we all have consensus for the short list for the finalists, and the finalists are they're the ones who are in the exhibition, and from those 5, so 1 per region, a winner is chosen.
But you're right about, I guess, like the pedigree of kind of past winners as well, and certainly I think it does have that kind of strong international kind of reach then, in a way that sometimes for those of us who are maybe sometimes a bit remote from what could be happening, certainly in some of the parts of Canada that are probably less metropolitan, it's kind of this kind of a great way to kind of get a sense of the practices that are happening across the country. And I'm also kind of intrigued by this idea that to remove the age limitations, but still to talk about emerging artists as acknowledgement, I think, of this sense that artistic careers can kind of take off at any point in somebody's life.
Exactly. So, I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, and it was more about how do you do that, because there was a certain identity of the prize, and this just felt like the right time. There was also artists who were coming to us and really, talking about the age restriction as something that we should really be thinking about and looking at. So I was very proud that, the decision was made. And this year, the jury chair is Sasha Suda, who's the director of the National Gallery. And so, it's kind of like we're sharing the responsibility, but she's the one who's really chairing the jury. And I think that's really great for her to have that opportunity to meet with artists and jury members across the country as well.
And of course, I also have to mention another big project on the horizon for you, taking you a little bit further afield, which is that you're curating the Kaunas biennial in Lithuania this year, opening in November of 2021. I don't suppose you'd be willing to give us a little preview of what you have in mind. I mean, what kind of thematic approaches are you taking? What kind of ideas are being explored there, and what you want to bring to the biennial?
Oh, it's, actually shortly after we met, I went
right.
to
That's right. You were on your way over. You were on your way over to the event.
That's right. And it was really great. And I got to see the Kaunas biennial. I got to spend a few days there and meet the director. I don't know, Kaunas was just such an amazing place, and quite different than what I'm used to in terms of even in terms of my experiences or my trips to Europe. And I was invited to curate the biennial, and I was really excited about it. Lithuania as well won the
I know, yeah, it seems to have.
So, the Golden Lion, and so it made it even more exciting to kind of know more about the art scene there. And the kind of like overarching event is also 2022. It'll be the cultural capital of Europe, is Kaunas. So, makes it like even more kind of interesting to think about that place at that moment. Yeah, so I mean, I started to think about some Lithuanian artists that I knew and some that I didn't know, and Jonas Mikas is one that I've been very interested in for a long time. That's the only name I'm going to give you. Not this time. You know, so thinking around survival and thinking about as well resilience. So it's a show that's really looking closely at human, human resilience and thinking around storytelling as well. So it's a lot of the works are very narrative. They're talking from personal experiences to, you know, works that are relating to community, but it's very much about stories of survival and how do we go forward as a species.
Thank you very much for the talk, and we'll have a chance now to turn it over to some live questions and answers from our audience. Thank you. Hi, welcome back. And welcome back, Josée. Thank you very much for joining us again. And thank you also for an absolute wonderful conversation. It's very enjoyable for me to kind of go back and look over these things and kind of think through them again. I'm also thrilled to see that people have been posting lots of questions as well, which is always a nice thing. So first of all, how are you? How are you keeping? And how are things in Ottawa?
I am very good. Thank you, Chris. It's there's a lot of snow here, so it's been a very snowy winter so far. Lots of skiing, so it's been good, and yeah, things are good. How are things there?
No snow, no snow, but it's chilly for us. Once again, thanks so much for the conversation, and you know, I think a lot of people picked up on some of the things that you were discussing there and you're talking about, and certainly after our conversation, I kind of went back and watched a whole load of Asuma stuff and even Jonas Mikas as well. I do want to jump in with a few questions from the audience, and including, I think we have kind of a relatively large Lithuanian contingent there.
Oh.
So that's always exciting. So please forgive me in advance for my mispronunciation of anybody's names, but Ogne Pavlovita says, Dear Josée, first of all, thank you for sharing your thoughts and experience. And she would like to ask, how do you think platforms can enable curators to work with young artists in an international context? And does the role or function of a curator, has this changed in terms of institutional dependence, community and artists? She's looking forward to meeting you in Kaunas, but I guess particularly this idea of working with young artists internationally, how you can kind of reach out to a more kind of, I guess, a global network of kind of younger contemporary artists.
I think that's a really good question. I've had the privilege during my research time here working on the Kaunas biennial to actually meet a number of young artists, and a lot of it is through recommendations from other curators. So I think, you know, it's sort of like the onus is on the person to do a little bit of that work to kind of contact curators or start to create a bit of a network that way. And even I've had the opportunity to meet some students as well. And that kind of opened my mind and my eyes to wanting to do more of that, because I think there was a really interesting opportunity to talk to artists who are not yet, you know, necessarily have a full form practice, but to kind of see what people are thinking about in different places. So I really appreciated that. I think so there's some young art fairs as well that I tend to go to, as well as prizes. I tend to, you know, being involved with the Sylvie Art Award makes me also think a lot about prizes and some that are for emerging artists, as well as kind of newly established artists. So I do tend to pay attention to those, and if there's artists that I'm keenly interested in, then I'll reach out to the curator to find out more.
I mean, I guess that's one of the benefits of something like of Kaunas as well, is to kind of go there and you know, you have I know obviously, you know, there are artists that you have in mind going there as well, but you have a relatively blank slate, I guess, to kind of go there and see things with a bit of a different perspective.
I think I did over 30 studio visits with Lithuanian artists as well, to just kind of really get a sense of what, as I said in the conversation, a sense of what the art scene was. And, you know, there's always a number of art scenes. So I don't think there's only one art scene, but, and that was really interesting also to meet artists from different generations and to kind of start to get a better picture.
I also have a question here from Yeva Triskauskita, who says she also cannot wait for the Accountants Biennial in 2021. And she says that in one of your interviews, you said that you want to create a meaningful experience for viewers. I think this is kind of a great question here, but she says, let's imagine you are that viewer. What fascinates you when you see art? And if you'd have to choose only one piece of art, any type, kind, what would be your favorite? Well, I mean, that's almost impossible, but what are those things that probably catch your attention? I guess, not necessarily even as a curator, maybe, but maybe just as a
visitor,
aficionado of art, I guess.
Yeah, I like to be surprised. I like things that that you don't necessarily get in the first moment, that there are things that stay with you, that you kind of live with a little bit. So I think that's a bit vague of an answer, but it's just thinking about some experiences where I've also had to change or grow to really understand the piece. And I think a lot about even my family and people who are maybe less knowledgeable about art, and some of the experiences that they've shared with me and things that have remained with them for over 20 or 30 years, which fascinates me. Like they remember exactly the works that they saw at the National Gallery. And to me, there's something very powerful there, very meaningful. So if there can be that kind of experience for visitors, that's definitely what I would be most interested in. And for there was a piece in Caught in the Act, and I remember talking to this grandmother. She was local, and she came to see the exhibition a number of times. And she shared with me that the first time she really didn't like a piece. And then she came back with her granddaughter, and her granddaughter loved it. And she said, I put myself in her place to kind of experience it in a different way. And she goes, now it's my favorite piece. So I like that idea that, there's a certain taming that sometimes needs to happen between the visitor and the art. And one of the most significant experiences for me before I was a curator was of a Louise-Bourgeois piece, one of the cell works. And it was embroidered on it. It said, art is a guarantee of sanity. And that resonated so much with me that I became very emotional, and I sort of realized that this is why art was so meaningful for me.
I have a question here from Aideen Barry, who first of all says that the Canadian Asuma Pavilion was excellent, and she applauds the representation of Indigenous people, especially the presence of Inuktitut language, not only in the printed materials, but that live streaming of television, popular culture, Inuit culture. I mean, also the broadcasting that they do from these kind of remote communities, which sometimes is, it's almost like a community television thing, but the access that they get is kind of stunning. She also wants to ask, was there any pushback to rename the pavilion, given the Inuits' position in relation to Canadian colonization? And was there any discourse, say, with Asuma or with Asiniak around these notions of renaming the pavilion, even temporarily?
Renaming the pavilion, that's a good question. It wasn't about renaming the pavilion, but, and we didn't show an image of the outside, but there were letters that said Asuma as well on the outside of the pavilion. So you had Canada and you had Asuma. And that was really important for the artists. There was also an interesting moment in the courtyard where we had a panel that, thanks our patrons, and we're, partners and whatnot. And next to that was the poster for the film, which was the ID tag of Zacharias Kunuk, so one of the founding members of Asuma. And this is a tag that was used, it has a number, it's called the E number, and E was for Eskimo, which is now a very derogatory term. And it had, so it was actually his own ID tag that he was given by the government. And it's like a leather disc, and Inuit were asked to wear that. So they were supposed to have it on them all the time. So definitely there were a lot of conversations about how to navigate that question around Canada, and the question around the government and the National Gallery. And when I talk about how I grew and how it changed things, that was really an important part of it too, was understanding that working for a federal institution can also mean that you're in, can be sometimes in conflict. And that took me a little while to understand and to find ways through that where I could really give more autonomy to the artists. And so there was a lot of really interesting learning that happened over the course of that project.
Well, I was really struck by the way you spoke about the collaborative nature of it, and also the work with Cindiac as well. And maybe it's worth kind of even mentioning that she's one of the 25 artists who shared the 2020 Sobe Art Award as well. So,
and I want to name the other curators too, because there was Catherine Croston, I'll get there, Candace Hopkins, and as well as Barbara Fisher. So, you know, we were a good group, and also kind of like cross Canada at the same time. So it was a very interesting group of curators.
Is there any advice you give to a young graduate hoping to work in curation? I think this is kind of interesting as well, because it's often not acknowledged. I think a lot of curators don't specifically go the art history route, but they come from a practice base initially. They come from, I guess, an interest in being an artist and then see a different way into it as well. So I'm not saying that Emma McHugh's question is necessarily from that place, but what are those maybe initial kind of stepping stones to kind of take someone into a curatorial practice?
Well, for me, I did an internship at the National Gallery, and that was really a great way to be exposed and to work closely. At the time, it was with the media arts curator, Jean Gagnon, and to kind of see like the everyday as well, and the sort of the more logistical side of curating. So yeah, I think that's a good way. There's so many different facets to curating. I mean, writing is a very important part as well. So I think writing and contributing to magazines, contributing to different publications, that's a very good way as well of getting your, you know, your name out there. I mean, that was what worked for me in a sense. I think there's a lot of independent curators and, you know, also curators working collaboratively. So I think there are actually more opportunities for curators than maybe necessarily having to work for a museum as in the past.
Naringa Kulik from Kaunas wants to say thanks for engaging conversation. Thank you. And she wanted to ask you what your impression was of the Kaunas Biennial that you saw in 2019, and if that influenced the way or informed the way you're working for the current edition.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I know I didn't spend as much time as I would have loved to, especially not knowing what the future had in store for us with COVID. So I was really planning to go back and spend more time in Kaunas. So my memory was being as fascinated by the exhibition as the town, and also some fantastic new museums that I discovered there. There's a Devil Museum in Kaunas that had a very strong impression. In terms of how I'm thinking about the exhibition, the biennial for this year, I think creating maybe more more kind of varied experiences for visitors, things that are sensory as well, that have kind of really a lasting impact, is something that I didn't feel as much in the last biennial, that I'm kind of thinking what I really want to focus on. So that would be one thing, and again, it's not a negative thing. It's more just, you know, thinking about. I think there was some very cerebral works, and that was very interesting. But I think I'm thinking more around something that's sensory in a different way.
Well, it's interesting because I think with biennials, once they kind of, you know, as they have, and you of course would know this as well as anyone, but you know, they carry that legacy with them as well. So it's not necessarily a reactive thing, but you know, there is a kind of building of a sensibility or kind of an idea around that place that just accrues as different kind of curatorial propositions come into it. I do have
there were beautiful works at the train station that I feel like those had a real lasting impression, and the idea that you were also visiting them in like an abandoned wagon, that was really interesting. Like so I there were some really strong moments that have remained with me, but I wish I'd spent more time to kind of really delve into all of the works.
I mean, after the conversation there, the pre-recorded conversation, I went back and I watched Jonas Mikas's reminiscences on the journey to Lithuania, which I think is kind of fascinating because actually it does end up in Kaunas at one time at one point as well, but also has this real kind of like ambivalent relationship to his home. That I thought was kind of fascinating. And you kind of mentioned this a little bit, I think probably after we stopped recording, about this idea of kind of bringing Jonas Mikas back to Lithuania and maybe kind of bringing all that attendant kind of historical baggage or kind of feelings of estrangement or feelings of kind of distance to it. So is that something you can maybe elaborate on? I know you don't want to give away all your secrets about the...
No, but I think, I mean, you know, I had the privilege of meeting Jonas, and this was in Switzerland, and we had a nice moment together. And, you know, he spoke about not having had many exhibitions in Lithuania, and I think that's going to change as well. And actually, 2022 is a centennial of his birth, centennial of his birth. So that also meant something to me, to kind of think about him, you know, like 100 years and his practice and where he came from, and also having traveled back to Lithuania and making work about that. And I'm working directly with his son as well, which is a really wonderful experience. So yeah, I think how it's feeding into other things is really thinking about what it means when you go through trauma, when you live something difficult, and how you can find resilience in that, and hopefully some healing. But if I was to say anything more about the show, is that I want to create this opportunity for connections, this opportunity for encounters, which is a bit of a theme in my practice as a curator, as well as yeah, these meaningful connections between artists, between works of art, and definitely with visitors as well, and to find some hope.
I think that's a really wonderful note to end on. Can I just say a very big thanks, Josée, for sharing all this with you. I know there are other questions that I can get to. Apologies to a very engaged audience here, but I think we could keep you all day. And I think before I say goodbye, just to say to everyone that this series will continue next month with Chus Martinez for our April conversation, with Drouin-Brisebois for May as well. So of course you're welcome to come back, and very happy to kick off this series with a really wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Josée.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation.